Inbreeding, Incest, and the Incest Taboo. Introduction by Arthur P. Wolfe. The chapters of this volume are the fruits of a conference held at Stanford University, February 24th through 25th, 2000. The conference was one of a series held to inaugurate the university's new Department of Anthropological Sciences. This was a happy and not entirely fortuitous conjunction of topic and occasion. The new department takes as its primary subject the relationship between biology and culture, and no point of contact between the two has generated more controversy than the relationship between inbreeding and the incest taboo. This was not the first time scholars representing the biological and social sciences gathered at Stanford to discuss what is commonly called the incest problem. In the spring of 1957, 7 eminent researchers, David F. Arberl, Uri Bronfenbrenner, Eckhard H. Hess, Daniel R. Miller, David M. Schneider, and James N. Sfuller, organized a workshop at the Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences to consider the problem of the origins of the incest taboo. Thus, we have an appropriate and well-defined baseline to assess the development of the topic in the second half of the 20th century. The changes are profound and will be readily apparent to anyone who compares Arberl et al.'s arguments with those developed by Patrick Bateson in Chapter 1 of this volume. I think these changes point to the direction anthropology is likely to take and ought to take in the new millennium. In 1878, Mark Twain, traveling up the Rhine on a barge, came to a small town perched on an instantaneous hill, a hill 250 or 300 feet high and round as a bowl. It was Dillsburg, whose 700 inhabitants, Twain learned, were all blood kin to each other, and have been blood kin to each other for 1,500 years. The result, according to the captain of the barge, was that for ages Dillsburg has been a thriving and diligent idiot factory. When, after a visit to Dillsburg, Twain noted that he saw no idiots there, the captain explained that this was because of late the government has taken to lugging them off to asylums and otherwheres. Twain comments, the captain probably imagined all this, as modern science denies that the intermarrying of relatives deteriorates the stock. This remained the majority opinion of modern science for the next 75 years, as is evident in the reaction to Edward Westermarck's suggestion that the psychical cause of the incest taboo has a biological foundation in injurious consequences following unions of the nearest blood relatives. Although Westermarck could quote in support of his suggestion the opinions of both Charles Darwin and Alfred Wallace, he was widely accused of ignoring the findings of modern science. Lord Raglan faulted him for having assumed that inbreeding is harmful in the face of all the evidence. Bronislaw Malinowski argued against him that biologists are in agreement that there is no detrimental effect produced upon the species by incestuous unions, and Robert Briffault claimed that there is not in the records of breeding from domesticated animals a single fact which indicates, much less evidences, that inbreeding, even the closest, is itself productive of evil effects. In 1924, Westermarck rebutted these criticisms in detail, but his arguments were universally ignored. Writing 15 years later, Leslie White had no doubts whatsoever about the relationship between inbreeding and the incest taboo. There is none. The theory that incest was prohibited because inbreeding causes biological deterioration is so plausible as to seem self-evident, but it is wrong for all that. Inbreeding as such does not cause degeneration. The testimony of biologists is conclusive on this point. According to White, inbreeding can only intensify the inheritance of traits, good or bad. If Dillsburg was an idiot factory, it is only because the founders were inclined toward idiocy. In societies where brother-sister marriage is permitted in the ruling family, we may find excellence. Cleopatra was the offspring of brother-sister marriages, continued through several generations, and she was not only handsome, vigorous, intellectual, but also prolific, as perfect a specimen of the human race as could be found in any age or class of society. Claude Levi Strauss, writing only a year after White, reached the same conclusion. He acknowledged E. M. East's work on maize and his view that because objectionable recessive traits are as common in the human race as they are in maize, folk beliefs about the injurious effects of inbreeding are largely justified. But he then argued that East's work has indirectly established that these supposed dangers would never have appeared if mankind had been endogamous from the beginning. His conclusion was that the temporary danger of exogamous unions, supposing such a danger to exist, obviously stems from an exogamous or pangenetic tradition, but it cannot be the cause of this tradition. Levi Strauss's preferred authority was George Dahlberg, who concluded that, as far as heredity is concerned, these inhibitions, i.e., the incest taboos, do not seem to be justified. When Aberle et al. Met at Stanford in 1956, they too appeared to have taken the position that inbreeding is not necessarily deleterious. But by the time they had published the results of their deliberations in 1963, they had changed their minds because of new information which appeared after the 1956 argument had been developed. This new information was, first, the finding that the ratio of deleterious and lethal recessive genes to selectively advantageous genes is very high indeed. And second, the finding that the percentage of individuals homozygous for lethal or deleterious recessives rises sharply as degree of relatedness increases. This led to the published conclusion that the biological advantages of the familial incest taboo cannot be ignored. Close inbreeding of an animal like man has definite biological disadvantages, and these disadvantages are far more evident as respects the mating of primary relatives than as respects other matings. In other words, Westermarck and Twain's captain were right all along. The present state of our knowledge of the consequences of inbreeding is summarized in this volume by Alan H. Biddles in Chapter 2. For Biddles, the question is not whether inbreeding is injurious, it is how injurious. Biddles' concern is that the rarity of sibling and parent-child unions, combined with their being tabooed, may have led researchers and makers of social policy to overestimate the dangers of close inbreeding. One possibility is that a rigorous examination, including determination of paternity, may only be initiated if a child shows symptoms of physical and or intellectual handicap. Another is that studies of familial incest do not have adequate controls for the potentially adverse effects of non-genetic variables, such as very young or advanced maternal and paternal ages, and unsuccessful attempted interruption of the pregnancy. Biddle's solution to these problems is to use cousin and uncle-niece unions to estimate the dangers of sibling and parent-child unions. The advantage of this method is that in many parts of the world, most notably Japan, South India, and Pakistan, cousin and uncle-niece unions are both legal and common. Consequently, we now have numerous studies, many conducted by Biddles himself, of the biological consequences of such marriages. Estimates based on these studies put the excess death rate among the progeny of sibling and parent-child unions at 16 to 20%, and the excess morbidity rate for such progeny at 6 to 16%. This suggests a total death and major disabilities rate of somewhere between 22 and 36%. Although the new information that changed Aberle et al.'s minds indicated that inbreeding was at least as dangerous as Biddle's estimates imply, they rejected the possibility that primitive man recognized this danger. This was a consequential decision because it denied them a simple explanation of the incest taboo. They could not argue that it is a consciously instituted prophylactic. But how then did the taboo come into being? Probably because Eckhard H. Hess was a member of their workshop, Aberle et al. Seriously considered the possibility that it expresses a disposition found in other species. Hess had shown that so long as they are reared together, Canada geese from the same brood never mate. Experimental work indicates that this fastidious behavior is the result of sexual imprinting. It is necessary to emphasize that the reaction persists without external sanctions. The luckless breeder who takes a male and female from the same brood to raise geese is doomed to disappointment. The pair will not mate even if no other partners are available. If, however, two members of the same brood are separated before hatching occurs and are subsequently reintroduced to each other, having been raised in different families, they may become mates. Although Aburo et al. Failed to make the connection, this is evidence for what has long been known as the Westermarck hypothesis. Westermarck argued that close inbreeding is injurious, but he did not argue, as Aburo et al. Mistakenly imply, that recognition of the fact led to the incest taboo. Instead, he argued that the deleterious consequences of inbreeding have selected for an innate tendency to develop an aversion to sexual relations with childhood associates. This tendency, not recognition of the dangers of inbreeding, was the source of the incest taboo. As he put it in 1934, in what turned out to be his last words on the subject, I must confess that the attempts to prove the harmlessness of even the closest inbreeding have not shaken my opinion that there is convincing evidence to the contrary, and here I find, as before, a satisfactory explanation of the want of inclination for, and consequent aversion to, sexual intercourse between persons who from childhood have lived together in that close intimacy which characterizes the mutual relations of the nearest kindred. We may assume that in this, as in other cases, natural selection has operated, and by eliminating destructive tendencies and preserving useful variations, has molded the sexual instinct so as to meet the requirements of species. Might it not be, then, that Westermarck was right about the effects of early association, as well as the dangers of inbreeding? Indeed, might it not be that Alfred Wallace was right in thinking that Westermarck had solved the incest problem? Abir et al. Do not give the possibility a moment's consideration. They mention what they call the indifference theory only for the sake of completeness. The indifference theory has both logical and empirical difficulties. It is hard to see why what is naturally repugnant should be tabooed, and the evidence for sexual attraction among kinsmen is quite adequate for rejecting the theory. We mention it only for the sake of completeness. The logical difficulties refer to Sir James Fraser's claim that the existence of the incest taboo is alone adequate to prove that Westermarck was wrong. In Sir James's words, it is not easy to see why any deep human instinct should need to be reinforced by law. There is no law commanding men to eat or drink, or forbidding them to put their hands in the fire. Men eat and drink and keep their hands out of the fire instinctively for fear of natural, not legal, penalties. The law only forbids men to do what their instincts incline them to do. What nature itself prohibits and punishes, it would be superfluous for the law to prohibit and punish. Accordingly, we may always safely assume that crimes forbidden by law are crimes that many men have a natural propensity to commit. If there was no such propensity, there would be no such crimes, and if no such crimes were committed, what need to forbid them? Instead of assuming, therefore, from the legal prohibition of incest that there is a natural aversion to incest, we ought rather to assume that there is a natural instinct in favor of it, and that if the law represses it, as it represses other natural instincts, it does so because civilized men have come to the conclusion that the satisfaction of these natural instincts is detrimental to the general interests of society. This argument has been repeated, mantra-like, by Westermarck's many critics. It was quoted in full by Sigmund Freud as early as 1911, and by Maurice Godelier as late as 1989. It was noted by critics as diverse in their views as George Peter Murdoch, Claude Levi-Strauss, Marshall Solins, and Richard Lewontin. It should be entered as Exhibit 1 by anyone arguing that 20th century social thought was biased toward what I call functionalist fundamentalism. The empirical difficulty Albero et al. Have in mind is Freud's claim that psychoanalytic investigations have shown beyond the possibility of doubt that an incestuous love choice is in fact the first and regular one. This is another anti-Westermarck mantra. It is repeated by A. L. Kroeber, Brenda Seligman, Leslie White, Alexander Goldenweiser, Claude Levi-Strauss, and Marvin Harris, to name only the best known of the many authors who quoted Freud against Westermarck. It is an essential part of functionalist fundamentalism because the view that human nature is selfish and unruly, perhaps even sinful, is necessary to the view that law exists because they are needed. Although Westermarck cited evidence suggesting that early association inhibits sexual attraction among many mammals, including horses and dogs, Albero et al. Ignored this and the experience of generations of animal breeders. It appears that they cited Hess only because it would have been impolite to ignore the work of an eminent colleague. Their unqualified conclusion was that there is no evidence to suggest that asexual imprinting occurs among mammals. Asexual imprinting does not seem to occur in man, the apes, the monkeys, or even in more remote mammalian species. We have therefore to assume that this adaptive device was simply not available, not a part of the genetic equipment of man's ancestors or relatives. Although Albero et al.'s conclusion regarding more remote mammalian species was unjustified, they can be excused for concluding that sexual imprinting does not seem to occur among the apes and monkeys. They wrote before primatology was an established research field. The difference this has made is dramatically summarized in Chapter 3 by Ann Pusey. After briefly reviewing evidence suggesting that inbreeding is injurious for most mammals, and more so in the wild than in captivity, Pusey catalogs a wealth of evidence indicating that something like asexual imprinting is found among our nearest relatives, rhesus macaques, baboons, gorillas, bonobos, and chimpanzees. Field and laboratory studies of non-human primates provide abundant evidence for an inhibition of sexual behavior among closely related adults, and the primate data support Westermarck's theory that familiarity during immaturity is a major reason for this avoidance. In several species, immature mates do engage related females sexually, but this behavior stops before the risk of conception. The incest taboo posed a nearly impossible task for the functionalist fundamentalists. Rejecting Westermarck in favor of Freud, they had to find a supernatural source for the taboo. Their solution was to resurrect and remodel Edward Burnett Tyler's 1889 suggestion that among tribes of low culture there is but one means of keeping up permanent alliances, and that is by means of intermarriage. The essential first step in the argument was to insist that the incest taboo is only a way of implementing exogamy. Newer say that marriage to persons standing in certain relationships is forbidden because it is rural, incestuous. But E. E. Evans Pritchard argued that we may reverse this statement and say that sexual relations with persons standing in these relationships are considered incestuous because it would be a breach of the marriage prohibitions to marry them. I would hold that the incest taboo can only be understood by reference to the marriage prohibitions, and that these prohibitions must be viewed in the light of their function in the newer kinship system and in their whole social structure. Putting exogamy before the incest taboo led to the remarkable conclusion that the incest taboo is the means by which human beings transcended their animal nature. For Leslie White and Claude Levi-Strauss, this made the incest taboo the passage between nature and culture. I put their formulations side by side to show how two authors who shared little else reached the same conclusion about the origins of the taboo. The similarity is evidence that they were responding to intellectual trends larger than themselves. First, Leslie White. In the primate order, the social relationships between mates, parents, and children, and among siblings, antedates articulate speech and cooperation. They are strong as well as primary, and just as the earliest cooperative group was built upon these social ties, so would a subsequent extension of mutual aid have to reckon with them. At this point, we run squarely against the tendency to mate with an intimate associate. Cooperation between families cannot be established if parent marries child and brother sister. A way must be found to overcome the centripetal tendency with a centrifugal force. This way was found in the definition and prohibition of incest. If persons were forbidden to marry their parents or siblings, they would be compelled to marry into some other family or remain celibate, which is contrary to the nature of primates. The leap was taken. A way was found to unite families with one another, and social evolution as a human affair was launched upon its career. It would be difficult to exaggerate the significance of this step. Unless some way had been found to establish strong and enduring ties between families, social evolution could have gone no further on the human level than among the anthropoids. And then Claude Levi-Strauss. It will never be sufficiently emphasized that if social organization had a beginning, this could only have consisted in the incest prohibition, since, as we have just shown, the incest prohibition is in fact a kind of remodeling of the biological conditions of mating and procreation, which know no rule, as can be seen from observing animal life, compelling them to become perpetuated only in an artificial framework of taboos and obligations. It is there, and only there, that we find a passage from nature to culture, from animal to human life, and that we are in a position to understand the very essence of their articulation. As Tyler has shown almost a century ago, the ultimate explanation is probably that mankind has understood very early that, in order to free itself from a wild struggle for existence, it was confronted with the very simple choice of either marrying out or being killed out. The alternative was between biological families living in juxtaposition and endeavoring to remain closed, self-perpetuating units, overridden by their fears, hatreds, and ignorances, and the systematic establishment, through the incest prohibition, of links of intermarriage between them, thus succeeding to build, out of the artificial bonds of affinity, a true human society, despite, and even in contradiction with, the isolating influence of consanguinity.